So on behalf of the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, I'd like to say welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Nicole Ferreira, and I'm a board member and current president of the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council. This year marks our 25th anniversary of the council working on our community partners, or with our community partners, to promote and support a healthy watershed. Over the past 25 years, the council has worked with local landowners and managers to clear 40 fish barriers and open 55 miles of salmon spawning streams. With the help of many volunteers, we've planted over 20,000 trees and shrubs to help enhance wildlife habitat and improve the quality of our waterways. We've had the pleasure of working with over 2,500 students and volunteers through our monitoring and assessment programs and our nursery. This past spring, the board took the time to reflect on where we've been and where we'd like to go. We identified 3 focus areas, with the top priority being to establish a robust advisory committee that represents the partners and stakeholder groups we work with. This group will help the council understand what the needs and opportunities are so we can better support and build upon the work that's being done. They'll provide technical expertise and help us to see project opportunities from various perspectives so we can increase our effectiveness. The second focus area is to refine our monitoring program to help us assess watershed health. The data collected helps us home in on opportunities for improvement, as well as measuring the impacts of current and past projects on system functions. And this meeting in particular is queuing up the discussion for our board meeting next month with our advisory committee to discuss water quality issues. The third focus area is to seek out ways we can support environmental education within the community at all levels. We partner with Columbia River Youth Corps and the local school districts and local scouting programs to provide hands-on education through our nursery and restoration projects. We're interested in exploring more ways to engage not only students, but community members and land managers as well. We want everyone to have an opportunity to get to know their watershed, whether that is engaging in a community discussion around stewardship or joining a work party to plant trees or pull weeds along the creek. We're excited to be hosting this discussion tonight on watershed health and stewardship in relation to water quality. And with that, I'll hand it off to Greg Pettit.
Thank you, Nicole. The Scappoose Bay Watershed Council has developed a schedule now. So every third quarter, or once every third quarter, we have a meeting dedicated to public information that we open up to the public, and we invite people to come in and be speakers. And that's the way tonight's is. Tonight's forum is on water quality issues, particularly in the Scappoose Bay Watershed, but I know we have people that probably are watching who are interested in what we know about water quality issues in Columbia County in general, and we might touch upon that in a little broader context. We've invited 4 speakers tonight. One could not make it as he was sick. Aaron Borisenko, who will be our first speaker, is the manager of water quality monitoring at Oregon DEQ. And I'd like Aaron to be able to give us a broad perspective in terms of how we assess water quality within the state and how that data that's collected is used by the DEQ in accomplishing its mission. He will also cover some of the volunteer monitoring stuff that the DEQ provides support for volunteer monitoring activities, which many watershed councils employ, and the support activities that the DEQ provides in terms of technical assistance, data management, auditing, that kind of thing. Sarah Kidd is with the Lower Columbia River Estuary Program. She's going to be presenting tonight on the monitoring that they were doing. So about 6 months ago, I was kind of trying to figure out what's going on with water quality monitoring within our area. And I got an extensive report that the Lower Columbia River Estuary Partnership put together, which Sarah did along with her associates. And I was impressed with the monitoring they're doing, and I think it provides a good foundation. A lot of the questions they were trying to address in terms of long-term trends and compliance with water quality standards are the questions I think that we needed to answer for our watershed. So I think we have a good foundation with the work that they're doing. And at this point, I'd like to kind of look at where we're at in terms of water quality and what we know about water quality in our basin. And then finally, We have Andrea Mosky, who is with the Oregon DEQ, and she's the Lower Willamette Basin Coordinator and works on the total maximum daily load issues. So when we talk about water quality and its relation to watershed health, I believe that water quality is kind of the foundation of the watershed health program under the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. And the history of the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board was to create watershed councils primarily to restore water quality, to improve the opportunities for salmons to sustain themselves in our basins throughout the state. Water quality reflects the overall health of the watershed. So all the activities that are occurring adjacent to the stream and upland from the stream have an impact on water quality. And so as a watershed council, we're interested in addressing all those activities occurring in the basin that ultimately affect water quality. But water quality is one of the fundamental things we want to address to make sure that water quality is adequate to support the beneficial uses that it should, as determined by the Oregon DEQ and by the Oregon Water Resources Board for those streams. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to Aaron to give his presentation, and then we'll move to Sarah, and then we'll wrap up with Andrea.
Thank you, Greg. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces. Hi, Pat. I am Aaron Borisenko. I manage the water quality monitoring section at the DEQ laboratory in Hillsborough. And I'm going to provide you with some sort of maybe larger statewide perspective on water quality through a couple of different programs. The ambient water quality monitoring program that we've been working on for about 50 years now, and the toxics monitoring program, which began sort of in 2008 and is ongoing. So let me share my screen. And could somebody let me know that you can see that, please?
We can see it, but it needs to be in the presentation mode. There you go.
Okay, so I titled this Water Quality in Oregon, a Hopeful but Cautionary Tale. And that is because I think in the last 50 years, we've made some tremendous progress, but we have a lot of work to do, and we have a lot of gains that we'll need to maintain. And so that's what we're going to be talking a little bit about in the beginning. So for today, we're going to talk about some general water quality information, really covering the time frame of around 1945 to present. And then we'll get into some toxics monitoring program information on water and tissue sampling that we've done looking forward. What we don't have time to discuss today are all these other programs in the monitoring area, really TMDL monitoring, groundwater monitoring, biomonitoring, pesticide stewardship partnership monitoring, cyanobacteria monitoring for harmful algae blooms, beach bacteria monitoring, the work we do around national aquatic resource surveys, and some information on wildfire impacts. There's a lot of stuff that we do at our laboratory that is just too comprehensive to cover today, but maybe I'll get invited back to talk about one of those things in the future. So as a water quality monitoring manager, you know, if you go to your block party or something, the first question people ask you is, so how is the water quality in Oregon? And I get that question from my mom on the right, from my son in the middle there, and from my mother-in-law on the left. And, you know, the answer to that question is, well, pretty good, but it depends on where you look, how you look for it, what you're looking for, and when you look. And so, you know, it's not a simple answer. And I know my family digs in a little deeper when I start to answer the question. I try not to bore them, but get them the information they're looking for. So hopefully I'll accomplish that today as well. So I want to start with an interesting study that was done by some fish biologists back in 1945. And there's a really great video from the Oregon State Library that you can get that kind of covers this work. This is a few snapshots from their work. What they did was they started in the upper Willamette, and they worked their way down to the mouth of the Willamette. And they took caged cutthroat trout, and they proceeded downstream, putting these caged cutthroat into the Willamette River. And then they timed how long it took these cutthroat to die. And unfortunately, they died pretty quickly once they got down to around Springfield, Eugene, because of low dissolved oxygen concentrations, lots of untreated sewage going into the rivers, as well as untreated industrial wastes going into these rivers. So this is a look at their data. On the right side, you're at the uppermost portion of the Willamette. So you're in the Cottage Grove area. And you have a line from 1929 and a line from 1944, looking at dissolved oxygen concentrations moving from Cottage Grove downstream to mile 0, where it enters the Columbia. And what you can see here in the dissolved oxygen, which are the upper 2 lines, is once you get to sort of Independence, Salem, things start to drop off. The dissolved oxygen concentrations begin to drop precipitously until they get down to a concentration of 3 and 4 milligrams per liter, which is well below what trout need to survive and thrive. The bottom 2 lines are biochemical oxygen demand, and that is caused by untreated effluent and chemicals entering the stream that really deprive the water of the oxygen needed for salmon to thrive. And what you can see is, again, around Salem, you start to get this real increase in the biochemical oxygen demand on the concentration. Really elegant little study they did. So where are we today? And this is, this is data collected from our ambient station on the Willamette River at the railroad bridge in the downtown reach. And what you can see is we have a lot of data, which basically picks up right where the study left off, and right around the 1940s, and we started collecting dissolved oxygen data, and we've collected right up until 2022. So the data here runs all the way through the most current data set. And you can see that our dissolved oxygen concentrations have made incredible improvements over that time frame. Now we rarely drop below the 8 milligrams per liter, which is kind of a criteria for salmon need to basically thrive in the river. So that's a real success story, and we can be proud that the Clean Water Act and controls that we put on the wastewater treatment facilities and industrial pollution sources have worked. And we've spent the money needed to make these amazing gains. The same thing can be said of bacteria, because we're trying to achieve swimmable, fishable. And so if you look at these fecal concentrations back in the early 60s, you can see they were well above our water quality standards, even for a single sample, which is a 406 colony forming units. But today we very rarely get exceedances either of our geometric mean fecal bacteria standard or our single sample bacteria standard, meaning that it is safe from a bacteria perspective to swim in the Willamette. And I love this quote at the top, which comes from the two, from Fred Merriweather and Kackelhofer, the authors. They say, the authors give thanks to many individuals who worked long, hard hours to supply the necessary information. And they're talking about their study back in the 40s. Some of the 70 to 75-year-old youngsters worked only in hope that the smaller youngsters might again be able to swim in the river. And, I think if they were to look at what we're looking at today, they would be quite proud of the accomplishments that have been gained over that time frame. So this is the ambient monitoring program on a statewide scale. We have 160 sites that we monitor 6 times annually. And those sites are predominantly used to do status and trends analysis for 8 different water quality parameters on a statewide basis. This map is accessible to you, and I hope you go visit it sometime on our website at the link below, and I'll provide this presentation later if you'd like. But what you're seeing here is the colored dots reference the condition of the sites that we're monitoring, whether we consider them in excellent, good, fair, poor, or very poor condition, based on the Oregon Water Quality Index. The arrow direction for the specific site, either up or down, shows if the site's improving or declining, or if there's no trend. And this gets updated each water year for the year, and is one of our key performance measures that we report on to our Oregon legislature. So these are the parameters that feed the index: water temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, biochemical oxygen demand, which is also called biological oxygen demand, total solids, nitrogen, so ammonia, nitrate, and nitrite, phosphorus, and bacteria. And what we see if we look over a period of time and it is a trend that kind of bounces around for these sites. And there's an interesting story in this graph. So you can see the beginning of the graph starts in the 80s, and that's because it took 10 years of data to start these trending analysis. So starting in the 70s, collecting data in the 80s, we started to have enough samples to do trending analysis. And we could see that many of the sites we were visiting were in a declining trend. We had problems going on with a lot of these sites that weren't being addressed. Then what you start to see, though, is that as the Clean Water Act was promulgated in the 1972, some of the impacts of ratcheting down on wastewater treatment facilities and industrial sources and TMDL started to take effect in the 80s, and we start to see this incredible gain in water quality on a statewide scale, and big improvements through the 80s and early 90s. Then you get into the early 90s, and we start to see this declining trend again. This is a real period, and this is a real period of growth for Oregon. We saw a lot of people moving into the state, a lot of population pressure, and one year, 1996, we had a real issue with some declining sites. We had 43 sites declining statewide, and 23 of those sites were located along the coast. And so one of the things we do with this information is try to understand what's causing either declines or improvements that we're seeing in these different areas. And when I talked to basin coordinators along the coast, they all said, oh yeah, well, there's been just a lot of logging activity over the last decade along the coast. We've seen a lot of road building, a lot of industrial activity, and we were seeing a lot of total solids increases in many of those locations, which helped to explain why we're seeing 23 of the coastal sites in a declining status. So the point being with this graph is it's a great way to sort of step back and try to think about what's going on in these different areas and what the trends are statewide with our water quality. So if you look overall, the percent of sites in good to excellent condition in Oregon is quite high. We've got about 50% of our sites in good to excellent condition, and we should be proud of that. But we've also got sites in the other three categories of fair, poor, and very poor. And so we want to try to move these sites upward. We want to get the fair sites into the good or excellent categories. We need to try to shift poor into the fair category and then continue to work on that. And very poor is going to need some real attention. And you can also look at the index and try to get a sense of what's driving the individual parameters in these larger categories. So for example, we've seen big improvements in the last year in water temperature. So a lot of work that people are doing to plant riparian areas, to try to mitigate temperature, maybe having some of the desired impacts we're looking for. But we've got issues still with dissolved oxygen in some of these locations, and nutrients continue to be an area of concern, these sort of red areas. So, you can dive in deeper into the index, and all of this information is online for you to look at to try to understand a little bit more about what the trends are and why. So in Columbia County, we've got two ambient sites. One is located on the Clatskanie River at Highway 30, and the other one is the Nehalem River at Birkenfeld. And we have, a fair number of samples at both of these locations over the years. We did see this little dip back in the 80s here, and looking more closely at it, it was related to fecal bacteria concentrations that seem, and I'm not sure specifically what was causing those fecal bacteria concentrations to increase, but it did seem to take several years before we reached back to this baseline free period here. So that's something to think about. These sites are in fair condition overall, so there is room for improvement. And this other site has kind of been status quo throughout the course of the year, so not much change at those two locations in Columbia County. So if you dive in deeper, this is all available online for you too. There's some really great information graphics here. So this gives you the information about Clatskanie River at Highway 30. We look at a buffer around the site to try to determine, generally speaking, what the land use, so mostly forested land use, its overall condition is fair. And in the last 10 years, there have been 3 years where we saw a statistically significant decline in water quality at the site, but the rest of the years were sort of flatlined and status quo. These are the individual parameters here at the top. So temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, biochemical oxygen demand, total solids, nitrogen, phosphorus, and E. coli. And in these individual categories, the colors correspond to sort of the general condition, blue being good to excellent, and then the orange color is poor and very poor. And the arrow gives you the direction of this individual parameter. So in the last 10 years, there's been a total decline in total solids at this site at Klatskanai, but an improvement overall in the nitrogen concentrations. If we look at Nehalem at Birkenfeld, we see an increase in an improvement, that is, in pH, and an improvement in phosphorus and in bacteria. So those are good signs, but we also see that generally speaking, the site has had some declines in the past 10 years. So those are things to consider and things that we try to reach out to our basin coordinators to discuss. One interesting observation I'll mention to everybody is I've looked at these for the whole state. And in the last several, like the last 3 years of Oregon Water Quality Index reports, I've seen improvements in phosphorus almost everywhere. That I'm struggling a little bit to understand why that's happening. And you can see the phosphorus improvements across the board. It's not just in Columbia County, it's not just in the North Coast, but it's been a kind of a statewide situation. I have read that temperature declines can cause less mobilization of phosphorus in the water column. And I have noticed that sometimes where we're seeing improving trends in temperature, we're also seeing commensurate improvements in phosphorus, but I'm not sure that it explains it very well everywhere. And it is an interesting finding that we're going to have to dig in deeper to explain. So I'm going to move on from the ambient program now and talk a little bit about the toxics monitoring program, which is another statewide program. Our goal for this program was to have statewide results for toxics monitoring, to have the results be comparable across the entire state, to make sure that the things that we're measuring were relevant to concerns that we had, and to try to sustain this effort through time. So what are we looking for? We're looking for a long list of things, over 350 different constituents. Current use in the categories of current use pesticides, legacy pesticides, pharmaceuticals and personal care products, brominated flame retardants, combustion byproducts, and metals. And this is kind of the where and when we've been looking for and how the program has progressed. I have to apologize for the color of the dots. They're very faint, but this is what was available to me. So on the left, you see the beginnings of the program, and we have all of these blue dots, which are water samples that were collected around the state over the time frame of about 2008 through 2016. And what we did is for the 15 Oregon basins, we did 3 basins per year to cover the entire state, and we sampled sites that were deemed were targeted towards what we consider risk factors for contaminants. And so we had discussions with our basin coordinators, with experts in the field in those areas, with knowledgeable folks in those areas, to try to identify where we should be sampling these locations. And then we would sample those sites 3 times annually because we wanted to pick up the different conditions of the hydrograph during the course of the year. So peak flow, a descending hydrograph, a sort of base flow period in the summer, and then ascending hydrograph in the fall months when you're getting your first freshets during the fall. And so through this rotational effort, we kind of concentrated on these high-risk sites in the first cycle of the program. In 2017, we stepped back from that, and we did a national lakes assessment where we incorporated toxics monitoring into this national lakes assessment. That effort had never been done in lakes in Oregon, and so it was a novel effort that we felt it was important to leverage our toxics monitoring resources to supplement. And that report, I will invite you to read. It's just recently been released and is on our website for you to take a look at. In the lower left is the product of our knowledge based on the effort that we made from 2008 to 2016. So our resources for toxics monitoring dwindled, and we wanted to create a network of sites that were the worst ones that we found in our initial effort, which are these purple ones. And I will say this, that if we just picked the worst toxic sites, they would all have ended up in the Willamette Basin. But it's a statewide program, so we pushed things into other parts of the state to make sure we had statewide coverage. So these are a network of sites that we attempt to monitor 3 times annually to start to do trending for our toxics monitoring contaminants that we identified in our initial effort. In the pandemic years, we didn't stop sampling. Our staff still went out, but because of pandemic travel restrictions, we tried to keep things closer to home where we could sample on a daily basis. And so, as I mentioned, many of these locations were the worst in the Willamette Basin. So we decided, let's do a concentrated look in the Willamette Basin while we have this opportunity. And so we collected more intensive data in the Willamette Basin in 20 and 21. Plus, there's very faint green dots here. We had those horrible fires in 2020. We went out and collected toxics monitoring information at the bottoms of these fires to see if we got any signals. So this is one way to interpret some of this information. The impact ratio is basically just a line where above this line, there's an impact either to human health or a potential impact to human health or a potential impact to aquatic life. And it's the actual concentrations at which there's an impact vary for all these chemicals. But what's the same about this is above the line is impactful, below the line is deemed as unimpactful. So you have human health criteria are the green dots, and the blue dots are aquatic life criteria. And the take-home message from this is that most of the things that we're finding that are above this line remain legacy contaminants, things that were banned, termite insecticides, DDT that still remains and is still breaking down. Those are still some of the most substantial impacts that we found through the work. With that said, we see a lot of chemicals around the state. And so priority metals, copper, zinc, lead, mercury, those metals are found almost everywhere. We see a lot of detections of current use pesticides, even though they may not be at concentrations of concern. And of course, legacy pesticides we didn't find everywhere, but when we did find them, they were at levels that were of concern for aquatic life and often human health. So this is kind of a breakdown here of the different categories and what we found. If you look at this through basins and these different components, you can see the Willamette Basin had the most overall number of chemicals in the waterway. And then Hood River, of course, there's a lot of pesticide use in Hood River, which is depicted by current use pesticides as that purple bar here, and then breaking it down to other basins around the state. So I'm going to keep moving here. Tissue sampling was collected in 13 basins across the state. It's more of a challenge to collect tissue, so we often partner with people to try to get us samples from different key areas. It's important that we understand bioaccumulative toxins and what those look like in fish tissue samples, and so that's why we worked on this. Plus, we did shellfish sampling for the toxics program along the coast. And we analyzed almost 400 different analytes in these different categories, and they were all analyzed following EPA guidance, and all of them passed our internal QC requirements. And what we found were 268 unique chemicals in fish tissue and shellfish. Many of them were below concentrations of concern in terms of human consumption concerns. We found the largest variety in the Willamette Basin, as I've mentioned, followed by the Rogue River in this case for tissue samples. Legacy contaminants were the highest. Mercury values were above fish consumption values almost everywhere, which is why there's a statewide consumption advisory for mercury. And legacy pesticides were found in higher concentrations in mussels and oysters than in soft shell clam species. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And we found inorganic arsenic levels in shellfish, recreational shellfish, above OHA fish advisory guidelines, but I'll tell you how we maybe provided some additional insight into how to deal with that. And these highest concentration of inorganic arsenic were found in the skin of the gaper and softshell clams. So if you look at mercury levels in piscivorous fish, as I mentioned, you can see that they're almost all above this red line, which is the DEQ consumption criteria. And that's why we have a statewide consumption advisory for mercury and a TMDL for mercury. Tissue detections by basin, the Willamette Basin being the highest again. In this case, the Rogue was second highest, Deschutes, Umatilla. And so it just gives you a snapshot of the different basins around the state. And this is the legacy pesticides in the shellfish. So we see, we saw legacy pesticides, and I will say, I don't want to alarm you by this. These are parts per trillion. So extremely low levels and below levels of concern for these contaminants, but they are present in these soft shell clams, mussels, and oysters for this set of different bioaccumulative toxins around the coast. So inorganic arsenic was the one that was above the screening value for Oregon Health Authority, which is 0.7 micrograms per kilogram. And what we found was we did analysis on the cutaneous portion of the skin, and it is that portion of the shellfish that houses most of the inorganic arsenic. So if you're concerned about consuming shellfish, removing that part really lowers the level of inorganic arsenic that people are consuming. Something to keep in mind. So briefly, looking forward.
What part is that again, Aaron? You say cutaneous. What is
sort
that?
of the skin portion of the mussel, the outer portion. If you clean that off, you're removing the bulk of the inorganic arsenic content. It's kind of like your hair and your nails are the ones that accumulate the inorganic arsenic. It's similar in the shellfish. So looking forward to try to keep us on time, we really need to remain diligent and build on our gains over the last 50 years. We need to protect our improvements and identify new threats to water quality. And we need monitoring data to understand our best course of action. I feel like some of the biggest threats moving forward are water quantity. And by that, I mean that because we're not water quantity monitoring, we're water quality monitoring, but water quantity impacts the quality by creating higher concentrations in the water that's left. And so if we have lower base flows in the summer months and we've got contaminants moving into these systems, the organisms that live in those systems are facing these higher concentrations of contaminants. So we need to be cognizant that as climate change impacts our base flows, that our work gets harder for us in protecting water quality, both in surface and groundwater. Water temperature is obviously a huge impact, and we're all concerned about the impacts of climate change on our runoff, on our base flow capacity, on just even drinking water availability. We were trying to do a study in Klamath groundwater, and many of the wells in Klamath had dried up that we had sampled in our initial sampling event, because these are drinking water wells for residents and they had dried up. So that's a big concern. And we need to be cognizant of nutrients that are creating problems with cyanobacteria and just deleterious algae growth, which nutrients impact all of these parameters: dissolved oxygen, pH, everything. So they're really an important thing to be focused on. And of course, emerging contaminants like PFAS, these forever chemicals that we're now measuring in our public water systems to look more closely if they're present. But we also have to be thinking about their fate and transport into groundwater in the long term. And 6-PPD quinone, which is the oxidizing protection that is in our tires, that was found to be a chemical of concern in Seattle that was killing coho that were returning to spawn. And then there's always new chemical formulations coming out that we know very little about, that we have to be diligent to understand their potential impact. So we have our work cut out for us, but we've also got some hopeful messages. So that's my presentation on general water quality in Oregon. There's a lot more we could talk about, and I'm sorry we don't have the time to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Could you briefly describe the volunteer monitoring program and the services you provide?
Sure. So the volunteer monitoring program largely supports volunteer monitoring organizations that get monitoring grant funding through the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, which received its funding to help restore salmon stocks around Oregon. And so the organizations that get monitoring grants through the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board get a lot of support from us. They'll get meters, they'll get supplies to do monitoring, they'll get technical assistance on quality assurance project plan and sampling analysis plan development, technical trainings on how to do different types of monitoring for different parameters. And we accept data from these groups and help by looking at the quality of the information and reviewing it. And we do that at the DEQ laboratory. And then that information is uploaded into our ambient water quality monitoring data system and used for a variety of purposes, including status and trends reports, more specific to specific areas, like your watershed, that is done by the watershed group in our headquarters. And it provides information for doing our 303D assessments, and just provides baseline information for a variety of other important reasons. Incredibly valuable program. Our laboratory cannot do everything that needs to be done, and the volunteer groups around the state really help to supplement and provide watershed specific information that's really needed to make good decisions on what needs to happen locally. And so we very much value the contributions of the volunteer monitoring organizations and try to help them where we can.
Thank you, Aaron. By the way, we had a couple of comments on the chat that I think people that may not be watching the chat might want to be aware of. We had a question about the source of mercury because we have a statewide mercury TMDL, and Andrea Mosca responded to that most of the mercury is atmospheric deposition. And I'm sure she'll talk more about that later when it's her turn to talk. So we got just a couple of minutes for questions. Please feel free to raise your hand or just go ahead and just speak up if you have a question. If not, I'm gonna make this comment. I want to thank Aaron. I think this presentation helps us think out time outside our narrow vision. A lot of times we get focused on one or two issues that we know are on the plate, like temperature or mercury or something, but there's a lot of other things out there affecting water quality that can impact beneficial uses that we need to be aware of. And oftentimes the reason we're not aware of those issues is we simply don't have the data to document the extent of the problem. So I want to thank you, Aaron, for showing the broad scope of the monitoring that you're doing in terms of trying to address these issues, not only in terms of toxics, but in terms of impacts on groundwater quality, drinking water supplies, and all that, and how that's all interconnected. So thank you, Aaron. So our next speaker will be Sarah. Are you ready to go, Sarah? And if we have more time for discussion at the end, that would be great, but we're pretty much on schedule right now, considering Nick wasn't able to present.
Yes, I can pivot. I just have to find my presentation. Sorry, Aaron, I just wanted to say that I really appreciated your presentation. It was extremely educational for me, and I feel like sometimes I get sucked into my vacuum of the Lower Columbia Basin and don't think about the rest of the state. So it's good to calibrate back to what's going on, and also just, the DEQ is doing great work.
Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, let me get my stuff queued up here. That's the wrong presentation. I had it all there and then I just clicked on something, as you do. Here we go. Okay. Can everybody see my presentation?
Yep.
Okay, great. I will do my best to stay within the time constraints of the group. I know it's late in the evening. So I'm going to give a very different talk, but also show data. My talk is going to be very, very specific to the Columbia County water quality that I help track and monitor with my team at LSEP. So Sneha Rowe, who couldn't sadly be here today because she's finally on vacation and she totally deserves it. She, for the last year or so, she's been running our day-to-day logistics with the program. Ian Edgar helps with the data analysis and data collection as well. And then we work really closely with Celine Kinney over at the Columbia Soil and Water Conservation District. They have been great partners since we started doing this work in 2017. And so I'm going to also wanted to give a shout out to all of our other partners. So clearly we're working with the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, the DEQ. All of the data I talk about is submitted to the DEQ. We have an SAP with them and a SAP, and we've been working with them since 2017. We are funded in part by OWEB, so that money is very important to this program. And then just in this last year, we've been working closely with the Public Health Department at the Columbia County and presenting to the county commissioners about these issues that we see. And hopefully we are going to continue those conversations and inspire maybe some, I'm not exactly sure what we're going to inspire, but hopefully more data collection and more public awareness of the issues that we see. And then just this last June, the City of St. Helens sewage treatment plant has started running all of our E. coli samples at cost, which has been a huge boon to the program. It really gives us a lot more money to spend on monitoring and not on processing samples. So these are all really important partners, and we're continuing to grow our partnerships. And so I just want to always make a shout out to those folks first. All right, so now I'm going to jump right into the history of the program. So some of you, you may or may not recognize me. I actually worked for the Watershed Council in, I think, 2009. I was hired on as a technician, and I worked while I was in grad school. The first few years of grad school, I was working as a technician, helping the Watershed Council do data collection, mainly with the water quality program, which was a volunteer water quality program, I think partially funded by OWEB at the time. We collected a lot of data, and I actually wrote a report back in 2011, publishing a lot of those results. And so it was just very much a happy accident that in 2017, when I was hired by the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership, that they were in the midst of starting a new program in partnership with Columbia County and with funding from DEQ to sort of revisit some of those sites that were monitored in the 2008 to 2011 study, and then also start some stats and trends monitoring across Beaver Creek Watershed and Claskeneye Watershed. So I was happy to be involved, and I've actually been involved ever since. So now, we're here at 2022, and I've been working with the program at different capacity. Now I'm more, I oversee and I help with all the data analysis and management and grant applications and these kind of things as well. And Sneha loves to do the water quality monitoring 4 days a month. So anyway, so that's where we're at today. And we are very grateful for the ongoing funding from Columbia County and OWEB. And I do want to make an update for folks who may or may not be aware. We applied for more funding from OWEB in the spring, and that is actually funding. It's an increase in our funding to do intensive monitoring in Milton Creek watersheds and McNulty watersheds. And I actually have some preliminary results. So hopefully if we get to the very end of the presentation, I will show you some results from the intensive monitoring we've been doing since June. And OWEB says it's very favorable that we will continue to get funding for this, which will start in the winter. So that will be voted on at the end of October. So we're above the funding line is what they told me at the moment. So hopefully we stay there and nothing changes. You don't want to count those eggs before they hatch though. So that's an update. We are now in year 6 of the water quality monitoring program, and we have been strongly encouraged by OWEB to apply for a multiple year grant the next time we do so. So hopefully we can maybe get funding through year 10, which is the ultimate goal at this time, is to have a 10-year program where we're tracking all these water quality conditions so we can have a better idea of where we need to focus our efforts for conservation and restoration to improve these water quality conditions. And so that is my speech about the program history. All right, now I'm going to plug our latest report. So we did a report in the spring, and it reports out on the 2017 to 2021 data. So this whole data set is reported out on, and we even did an online public dashboard where anyone can go and they can click around and look at all the data, see our interpretations of the data, as well as download the full PDF report. Again, DEQ also has all of these data in their online system as well, so you can access it that way. You know what I'm going to do now is talk about the history of monitoring. So now I talked about the history of the program, but where have we been monitoring and how has it changed over time? So you can see here, I have a map of the watersheds, and in that 2008 to 2011 monitoring, it was like 27 sites in the Scappoose Creek watershed subbasins. So Milton Creek, North Scappoose Creek, and South Scappoose Creek. So it was a really intensive monitoring in those basins. In 2017, we tried to recapture some of those sites, some kind of in the high upper elevation areas and then in the low reaches across the Scappoose Creek watershed subbasins, and then expand that monitoring into Claskeneye River watershed and Beaver Creek watershed. Now in June, just recently, we increased our monitoring across essentially now, instead of just monitoring 2 areas in Milton Creek, we monitor 9. So looking at the subbasins of the Milton Creek subbasin to try to track down sort of where the water quality is good and bad and how it's all mixing up. And then we also added McNulty, which was not originally monitored. And people have a lot of interest in McNulty Creek. And so we've added 2 monitoring areas in that. And so now we're moving forward with all of the monitoring. And what are we monitoring? Now, this is a good question because Aaron talked about a lot of metrics. We are monitoring E. coli bacteria. We are monitoring turbidity and conductivity, pH and dissolved oxygen. Some of these have been added on and the intensity have changed over the lifetime of the program. One thing that hasn't changed is the continuous monitoring of temperature conditions. And so we have the time series data that really allows us to get at how many days over a certain threshold of temperature have we seen, and then kind of comparing them across sites and then across years. All right, so now I'm going to jump directly into the results. And I'm going to try not to move too quickly, but also realize that I will summarize all of my findings at the end. And then at any time, you can go to the report where I've pulled this or go to the online dashboard and look more closely at the graphs if you want to dissect that data further. And of course, always ask questions. Okay, so today I'm just going to talk about temperature and E. coli because those are the ones that seem, well, they're problematic. And then also there's the most interest around them at this time. And we don't really have time for me to talk about all of them. But I'm happy to answer questions about DO and turbidity at the end if people do have those questions. Okay, so why do we monitor temperature in the streams? Well, aquatic organisms really depend on the temperature of the stream for their health and their livelihood. A lot of times we couch temperatures by salmonid life cycle conditions, what salmonids prefer. And this is really, it's important for more than just salmon in the stream, but because we do tend to couch all the things with the salmon focus, we do talk about that in this presentation as well. So generally, salmonids like it below 18 degrees Celsius, and they really don't like it above 25 degrees Celsius. So, we have a lethal limit and then a suboptimal limit. And we're going to talk about all of the temperatures today, couching kind of in that lens. All right, so what do we see across all subbasins that I've discussed? So all the ones we monitor, we see that there are suboptimal conditions. And this is flowing as you would expect. As the waters come from the headwaters, they're nice and cool. They get thermally loaded as they move down the watershed, likely due to lack of riparian shade. And we see these suboptimal conditions as you get into the lower watershed areas. In 2021, we saw sort of a record number of really bad days, so lethal days across all these lower watershed conditions, and just generally very dramatic increases in temperature compared to previous years. So if you remember, 2021 was a really hot summer, it was really dry. And so for me, when I'm thinking about these data and I'm thinking about 2021 summer, is this what we are expecting as we move into a stronger climate change scenario? So it is kind of one of those things where you can kind of think about it in a future lens or looking into a crystal ball. Well, we have a really, really hot summer. How is that looking across the watershed? Do we need to be adaptively thinking about how we're managing restoration to try to reduce the stress on these when these really hot conditions come along? Okay, so now we're going to jump into the data. Now, maybe not everyone is interested in Class Kenai, but I have it and I will talk about it here. So I know we're Scappoose focused, but you'll have to stick with me to get there. So the Class Kenai River watershed is, so you can see, so I'm going to have a map and I'm going to have box and whisker graphs on each of these slides. So the map is over here for Class Kenai. You have Little Class Kenai down at the bottom right-hand corner. And then as we move up the screen, you can see that the water is flowing downstream. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but you have Little Class Kenai at the headwaters and then Lower Class Kenai as you go to the main stem. And then you can kind of see how it flows into the Class Kenai city. So you can see the temperature gradient. It gets hotter as you move down to Lower Class Kenai, as you would expect. You can also see in the box and whisker plot, major take homes here is that you can see the seasonal trend of increasing temperatures in the summer, as you would expect. So one thing that we saw as sort of an update to our general data set was that in 2021, it was very, very warm, and we had 4 lethal days in the mid Class Kenai location. So that's over 25 degrees Celsius. Right. So now moving to Beaver Creek watershed. So now I've couched the Beaver Creek 2 locations here next to the Class Kenai. You can kind of see them in relation to space. And Upper Beaver Creek. So if you're not familiar with the Beaver Creek watershed, or excuse me, the Lower Beaver and Upper Beaver Creek watershed areas, the upper portion of Beaver Creek watershed is actually much more developed than the lower portion. So this is something to keep in mind later on. So, but we do see that thermal loading as you move down the watershed. And in 2021, Upper Beaver Creek, which is normally cool in most years, had the first year where almost all of the days in July and August were above the 18-degree thresholds. That was unfortunate. But again, kind of thinking future about this, do we need to be thinking proactively about restoration actions to reduce the stress of these really warm conditions on our fish and other aquatic organisms? All right, now we're moving into Milton Creek. Now this is going to look different. I have like a heat chart here. This shows you sort of the monthly average temperatures. You can see that we're also comparing to that 2008 and 2011 data. And then in the map below, we have both those sites showing up here. So we have the sites that were monitored in 2008 to 2011, and then of course the current study locations. Now I have an updated map that I will show at the very end, showing all of the intense monitoring that we just started out here. But for now, this is the essentially long-term sites that we're monitoring. The major take homes here are that it's really warm in the lower watershed here. In 2021, we had 8 days above the lethal limit. And I will say that I do tend to always go out in September with my crew, and we commonly see dead fish in Lower Milton in September, which is sad, but also maybe expected based on the water quality conditions we see out there. Okay, now North Scappoose Creek. We also see warm temperatures in North Scappoose, but a little bit less than Milton. In the, again, you can kind of see these historic and current monitoring locations are nearby to each other. And generally, we have seen an increase in temperatures over time. And this tracks with what they report out in the Columbia River Basin, or the Columbia River itself, where the Columbia River has warmed over time due to climate change. We see this similar trend in the tributaries. In 2021, we saw 2 days above lethal in the lower North Scappoose location. All right, and then the South Scappoose Creek, similar story, a little bit hotter than the North Scappoose, the lower water monitoring location, 5 days above the lethal limit in 2021. So again, these are really extremely hot summer conditions, not great for the salmonids. All right. Now, I realize I've not given anybody enough time to really look at all the information on this, on these figures or on this PowerPoint. We will share the PowerPoint. And again, I have updated data in the Tableau online where anyone can click through it. It's very interactive. All right, now the water quality results for E. coli. How am I doing on time? All right. Oh, I'm at time. Well, I'll just jump.
You got about another 10 minutes total.
Okay, I can make it then.
Okay.
All right, so E. coli is an important thing to monitor because a lot of these streams are used for recreation. I was just yesterday, I was out in McDulty. I was doing the water quality monitoring. A local came down. She's like, "Oh, this is our favorite watering hole. It's full of kids all summer long." So it's kind of important to understand from a human health perspective what the water quality conditions are there for swimming. So E. coli is a bacteria. And it is an indicator that, if you ingest that water, if it's above a certain limit, you may get ill. It's likely that E. coli is likely coming from human waste or animal waste in the watershed. And we're still kind of trying to figure it out. Like, why do we see these really high E. coli numbers? It's also not great for salmon either. So, it's an indicator of overall water quality, and we don't necessarily want to see high E. coli at all, not just for humans, but for the other aquatic organisms. All right, so now jumping into our overall results, generally we see Clascani. It doesn't really have a lot of E. coli issues. Occasionally you see an event, but it's not a consistent issue. Upper Beaver Creek and Lower Milton and the lower North and South Scappoose Creeks have critically high E. coli levels, where they commonly have their geometric mean, which, thank you, Erin, for introducing that concept, above the threshold. So this is something that is really critical to be considering. In 2021, these conditions did not improve, continued to show that they are very problematic. All right, so now you can see some of the data. Again, Clascani River watershed, not a huge issue. Occasionally that middle Clascani area has a lot of agriculture going on right there, a lot of cattle, possibly some contamination from that, but it's really not a consistent issue. And then, and I have these beautiful photos to show you that you cannot see the E. coli in the water. They all the sites look gorgeous and you want to go swimming in them. But occasionally you might get sick. So you can see that I have photos from all of our monitoring locations. These temperature things are showing you if there are temperature issues. If it's red, there's temperature issues. If it's green, there are some temperature issues. If there's a big X through the swimmer, then there's E. coli issues. All right, so now moving to Beaver Creek. Upper Beaver Creek does tend to have some consistent E. coli issues. Again, that's a more heavily populated area. We do not see those same issues in Lower Beaver. So you can see Upper Beaver here. This is actually Girt Creek, is an upper tributary for the Upper Beaver watershed. And then Lower Beaver, you can see that actually is quite pretty, but does have temperature issues. All right, now Milton Creek. We have given a specific talk on Milton Creek's water quality to the Columbia County. And so if you were at that, you probably heard this already, but you can see that there are a lot of issues. We have an upper Milton Creek water quality monitoring area and a lower, and then I'm going to work on getting to the point where I show you the very intensive map and all of the E. coli data that we collected this summer. But it's critically high all year round. So that's something to also consider. And here are those locations. So, it doesn't look unappealing, and you might want to sit there and have your lunch or take a dip, which is misleading. All right, and then we have Upper North Scappoose and Lower North Scappoose. Upper North Scappoose, occasionally we see some issues. But it's not as problematic as the Lower North Scappoose, which is very high most of the year. And these conditions seem to have worsened over time. However, the intensity of monitoring in the 2008 and 2011 data set is not as intensive as we have been monitoring in the most recent data set. All right, so you can see here again, very pretty areas, but fairly high temperatures and E. coli. South Scappoose Creek watershed. It's Unfortunately, a very similar story, especially in the lower South Scappoose Creek area, very high conditions all year round for the E. coli. And you can see these areas in the photo. And for us, we don't see the E. coli always correlating with temperature issues. So what does all of this mean? So I have some summary slides where you'll see them all the same things again, but just kind of pointing out that, you know, across these watersheds, we do see some temperature issues. We see some E. coli issues. There's also, if you wanted to get deeper into the data, we see some issues with turbidity and DO. pH is typically fairly good. Oh yes, here you can see I have a little dirty water drop. That means that at Girt Creek, we have some turbidity issues. This is the Beaver Creek watershed again. And then for the Scappoose Bay watersheds, we have some turbidity issues at Milton Creek, but not so much in the North Scappoose or South Scappoose Creeks. All right, so next steps. We believe that we should be letting folks know that there are E. coli issues across these sites. It has been years of data collection with consistent 90-day geometric means above the threshold for letting folks know. We need to increase riparian buffers. We need to reduce thermal loading for temperature issues, and really continue to investigate sources for these E. coli issues that we see. Now, what are we doing to address all of these data that we found? Well, there was a focused work group, which the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council was an important part of, and we decided that we needed to do a focused bacteria study in Milton Creek. And that included adding a lot of sub-basins to kind of see if we could identify where maybe some of these issues might be occurring and if it might be leaking from septic systems. And so we increased the frequency of our sampling and the locations of sampling, and we also were sampling places like Dark Creek. And right now we are, again, working on acquiring more OWEB funding, more consistent funding to monitor this long term. And this is a crawdad I just picked up yesterday. Isn't it cute? Okay, so I'm going to skip to the new data. So this is the Milton Creek watershed and the McNulty Creek watershed. So if you're not familiar with the McNulty Creek watershed, that's these two areas that we added for monitoring. The stars don't really mean anything other than everything is a star, but I did put a box around like our historic monitoring. So those two sites with a box, that's where we've been monitoring. And then everything else is additional monitoring since June. And this is the data just from June to August 2022. I didn't have time to do the geometric mean today, but for most sites, we have enough samples and enough time of data to do that. I think that one thing that should maybe call your attention is that all the orange stars mean that there are E. coli issues, was not necessarily what we were expecting to see when we added a lot of monitoring, but it is a result. And as we continue to collect more data, we will be able to hopefully pick up some patterns across the watershed. Right now I'm showing the max E. coli reading that we've had between the June and August. And so this is some sampling. We go out twice a month and do the sampling in the summer months. And so we just finished our first iteration of sampling Monday and Tuesday for this month, and then we're going to go out in a couple of weeks and do it again. All right, so I'm just going to leave it on this side and ask if, or actually I do want to show the next slide because we did go to Halloween Town on Monday, which is in St. Helens, and it was fun at the end of the day after we dropped off our samples at the sewage treatment plant. So if you have questions, I'm sure you have questions. I'm happy to answer them. Also, I'm happy to provide the data and the Tableau dashboard link. Thank you. Yes, Aaron.
Sarah, really nice presentation, and that's why volunteer monitoring organizations are so valuable, because there's such in-depth information. So thank you for that. I was looking at a lot of the streams, and it looked like the width to depth ratios are, it's like they're wide and they're shallow, a lot of the streams. And I'm wondering about temperature and the impacts of that on temperature, and there's been a lot of discussions about creating cold water refuges for salmon to find those cooler water areas that are deeper and maybe have better connection to groundwater, so that when these critical periods hit in the summer months, they have a place to escape and get to cooler water. And then, you know, if those are created through time and spaced out, then we can start making these connections across the water body to have a, you know, a system where these salmon can move from cold water spot to cold water spot to escape and get what they need.
And Aaron, that is kind of the basis of our strategy for repairing and restoration, is to concentrate on areas that ODF&W has identified as critical rearing areas that have the best water quality, and try to focus on protecting those areas. Sarah, I want to thank you so much for the presentation. I wish we had about 8 hours. I've got so many questions and things I'd love to discuss about the data you presented. But I think what we know right now is at this kind of presentation, there's no way we can get into the details of everything and have all the discussions that we would like to have. But I think it's really important that you guys are collecting the kind of data that we need to start identifying what some of those real issues are and what kind of follow-up work we need to do, because this is leading into Andrea's presentation. So part of the way we address water quality issues in the state of Oregon is we need to know what's going on, and that all starts off with monitoring. But after we've done our monitoring and we've identified what the trends are and what areas have water quality problems, by water quality problems, I mean those areas that do not meet water quality standards that are established to protect the beneficial uses, swimming, water contact, fisheries, those kinds of things. Then we need to start figuring out what we can do to address those problems. And in Oregon and across the nation, actually, under the Clean Water Act, when you do not meet water quality standards, then you're required to develop what's known as the total maximum daily load. And there's total maximum daily loads for point sources, which are relatively easily developed, but then it's much more difficult to deal with how you address the loads coming from non-point source activities, which will often be in the case of such with the E. coli situations we see in our stream and the temperature as well. So that leads right into Andrea's presentation. But I just want to say that the presentation that you guys give, I think, provides a really good background for the discussions we're going to have following up in future meetings with the advisory committee we're putting together. So thank you. Andrea, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Greg, for that intro. Sarah, it's kind of funny when I was listening to your presentation, I'm like, well, that's where all the data came from. You were just talking about, you know, and it definitely showed up in our assessment in our latest integrated report. So we'll kind of go over some of that information. So here, let me go ahead and share. Okay, can you see okay?
Yes.
All right. So yeah, I'm kind of the caboose, I think, of the presenters, and I think it kind of makes sense actually, because I'm not going to talk about specific monitoring sites like Sarah did, but basically what happens when data from groups like LSEP, watershed councils, and other kinds of state and federal agencies, when they send their data to DEQ, you know, what do we do with it? How do we assess it? So I am mainly going to focus on that. Just quickly about me, I am the Lower Willamette Basin Coordinator. There's a number of these basin coordinators across the state. We focus on watersheds. And so I actually have a small area, which is the Lower Willamette, and that covers, actually I go into the middle of Willamette just a little bit, but from about Wilsonville now to St. Helens. So that's the area that I cover, a lot of cities, but a small geographic area. So basin coordinators, they work with developing total maximum daily loads, just as Greg was saying, these clean water plans. We work with different responsible parties that are responsible for implementing these TMDLs. So those can be cities, they can be counties, state and federal agencies, they can be drainage districts and irrigation districts. So I work with them on their TMDL implementation plans and annual reporting and assessment. I also administer 319 grants. So those are grant money that we get from EPA to implement non-point source projects across the state. And I know the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council has received several of those 319 grants. We do technical assistance, and I also respond to water quality complaints that we get in. So it's kind of a wide range of work that basin coordinators do. So let me go in. So the outline is just talking a little bit. I'm not sure how much I'm going to, some of this information I think has already been covered in some of these other presentations, so I might not focus too much on them, but I do want to focus a bit on the integrated report. Greg did want me to give an overview of what water bodies within the Scappoose Bay watershed areas have been 303 delisted. So they've been listed as impaired based on data that we have received. So I want to talk a little bit about the integrated report, and then the water quality impairments that have been identified in the Scappoose watershed, given some of Sarah's team's work, collecting data out there, plus other groups as well. And then the total maximum daily load program, just a little bit about that, what it is. And we do have some new designated management agencies that have been identified in the Mercury TMDL for the Willamette Basin in the Multnomah Channel area. So just talk a little bit about that. I won't spend too much time on this, but basically our role and DEQ's role is we develop water quality standards. A lot of times we look to EPA's national criteria to implement them in the state of Oregon. Sometimes they're the same criteria, sometimes they're a little different depending on the circumstances. Our standards can be kind of complicated. So if you are looking them up at times and you're a little confused of what they are, please feel free to give me a call. I can help you out as best as I can. If I don't know it, I can find someone that can help you out. There are standards based, for the protection of aquatic life, for human health criteria, ones that apply in freshwater, saltwater, and then also seasonally based or based on spawning time. So it actually can get kind of confusing. So, feel free to reach out if you ever have any questions about that. So that kind of sets the stage with the standards. And then what we have an assessment team that's lab staff and headquarters staff that they've developed an assessment methodology. So it's basically, what do you do with all the data that we get? So every 2 years, we solicit data from watershed councils, state and federal agencies, cities, counties, people that are collecting high quality data. They submit it to DEQ and we assess it against our assessment methodology for each one of those pollutant parameters. If you're ever interested, one thing if you're interested in what that is, we do have an assessment methodology document, which I'll point you to in some slides further ahead. But it's really interesting to see, how DEQ, because we have standards, but there's also different assessment methodologies to determine whether, given the data that you have, whether it is impaired. What's also interesting is that it has methodologies for delisting it. So if you are collecting data out in the watershed and you think for some parameter might be getting better, to be able to collect the data that DEQ needs in order to get it off the impaired water bodies list. So what is that data needed? So I would highly encourage folks that are collecting data out in these watershed to take a look at that assessment methodology. And then from that, so once it gets on the integrated report, this integrated report it's not this long narrative report. It's really a database of our water bodies across the state, and it tells you what the status of it. Is it meeting standards? Is it meeting one standard? Is it impaired? Does it need a TMDL? Once we've assessed it, if it's determined to be impaired, generally we need to develop a TMDL for it. So these are these pollutant budgets, these total maximum daily loads that look at non-point sources of pollution and point sources of pollution, and comes up with a budget to over time meet water quality standards for that TMDL pollutant. Okay, let me go on here. Okay, this gets at it a little bit more with the different categories. And the reason why I wanted to show this is because you will see these categories. Category 2 is just at least one of the beneficial uses is being supported. We don't use category 1 because we really usually don't have the information to show that all beneficial uses of a water body are being supported. So category 3, there's not enough information to determine support. So we can't say it's meeting it. We can't say that it's not meeting standards. And generally that's just because of the data that's collected. We might just not have sufficient data in order to make that determination. Category 4 is that it's showing that a use is not being supported, meaning that a water quality standard to support that beneficial use is not being met. But in this case, a TMDL is not needed. And that's because a TMDL generally is already in place to address that pollutant. And then category 5 is beneficial use not being supported, meaning that a water quality standard isn't being met and a TMDL is needed. So basically both category 4 and category 5 mean they're impaired water bodies, but the difference is in category 5, a TMDL is needed. So I wanted to point you to, this is our website right here. In order to access this web-based assessment of our water quality status across the state, this is our 2022 integrated report. It's actually just hot off the press. EPA just approved this report September 1st. So this is all new data in here. This is where you would find that database, and it's fairly intuitive, but there are terms in here that might be a little confusing to the public. If you have questions, again, you could reach out to me and I can do my best to answer questions, but I would encourage you to go here and take a look. You can zoom in this area where the Multnomah Channel is, Scappoose Bay area, to find what water bodies are impaired for what pollutant. If you go to the website, another way to do it too is just Google for water quality assessment DEQ, and I think it would probably take you to this page or pretty close to this page. This is the approved integrated report, and you would click on this EPA approved integrated report to get, you don't get directly here, but this is a link once you get there to get to this database. So basically what I'm going to do is I use that database then to go through different watersheds. So the Scappoose watershed, Milton, and show exactly, given all the data that has been submitted to DEQ, what water body is not meeting water quality standards for certain parameters. So here is, trying to move, I have some boxes that I'm trying to get out of the way here so I can see my slide. Here, I'm gonna move this here. So this is the South Scappoose watershed. And what this is saying, so this is South Scappoose Creek, can't speak tonight, is the upper part. So this is the dotted line right up here. The green are monitoring sites. So if you got on our database and you clicked on them, you could see who collected that data. And I have a little box down here. The data sources for all these maps that I'm going to show you were from the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, the Columbia County, SWCD, ELSA, DEQ, and the Willamette River Keeper. So those were basically all the collectors of this data in this watershed, as well as the other watersheds that I'm going to show shortly. So the South Scappoose Creek in the upper part is not meeting standards for temperature for the protection of spawning, salmonid spawning. So salmon need cold temperatures for the eggs to thrive in the redds. So that's a different criteria specifically for spawning. It's also not meeting bacteria, which isn't surprising given Sarah's presentation that she had. I'm just going to point out, the column over here is whether there is a TMDL in place for those pollutants. So for all of these, except for bacteria, we do not have a TMDL in place yet. We only have a bacteria in place for a bacteria TMDL in place for bacteria. And that is actually part of the Willamette Basin 2006 TMDL. But let me keep going through here. So the lower part of the South Scappoose Creek is not meeting standards for oxygen for spawning, temperature year-round and spawning, as well as bacteria. And then Raymond Creek, which is right here, isn't meeting standards for the spawning dissolved oxygen. Go to the next one. So this is the North Scappoose watershed. So in the upper Scappoose watershed, right up here where the dotted line is, not meeting standards for spawning, oxygen for spawning. The creek in the lower part down here, it's not meeting for oxygen for spawning, temperature both year-round and spawning, as well as bacteria. And then we have Lizzie Creek here. Cedar Creek's here. Brush Creek, I think, yeah, is here, and Alder Creek is here, not meeting dissolved oxygen standards for the spawning criteria. And again, we only have a TMDL in place so far for bacteria. Okay, I'm trying to go forward here. There we go, Scappoose Creek in the Bay area. So here we go here, Scappoose Creek, where it goes into the Bay. We're not meeting standards for year-round and spawning for oxygen or for E. coli, for bacteria. The Bay's not meeting the bacteria water quality standard. And McNulty Creek here is not meeting our biocriteria standard. And our biocriteria standard is based on freshwater macroinvertebrate communities. So basically, I think some of you are probably familiar with this. You go out and collect critters in the stream, like macroinvertebrates, and you look to see what kind of insects you find, you know, mayflies, stoneflies, snails, worms. And it's compared to a reference site that has less disturbance, again, the least amount of disturbance, and you compare those communities to see whether the place that you're sampling at, how close is it to those reference conditions. If it's not very close, and this is non-technical terms here, then it gets listed for not meeting our biocriteria. So McNulty Creek isn't meeting that. And then the Milton Creek watershed here in the upper part, which is the dotted purple line right here, it's not meeting year-round and spawning criteria for oxygen. Milton Creek, the lower part, so that is this going all the way down here, is not meeting the oxygen criteria for spawning or temperature year-round or spawning or bacteria. And then Salmon Creek, which is right here, is not meeting year-round and spawning for oxygen. We have Cox Creek, I believe, right here for oxygen, both year-round and spawning. Dart Creek, which I believe is right here for oxygen, year-round and spawning, as well as Perry Creek, same thing. Oxygen, year-round and spawning. And then the last one I have is just for the Multnomah Channel. Oops, itself, right back, sorry, back. There we go. So the Multnomah Channel right here, it's not meeting standards for temperature or for DDD or DDE, which are breakdown products from DDT, as well as our methyl mercury criterion standard, which is our only standard that we have where we measure it in fish tissue. So we do have a TMDL in place for mercury for the whole Willamette Basin, and that was a fairly recent one, which I will talk about in my next slide. But otherwise, we just a note on temperature. We still have a temperature TMDL in place based on the Willamette Basin 2006 TMDL, which was a very large TMDL with a number of TMDL pollutants. But I will explain why in a minute, why when it says TMDL in place, we do, but it's considered to be in category 5, needing a TMDL. And again, I'll explain that in a second. So just to talk briefly about, as I mentioned before, when streams get on the 303D list as impaired, we need to develop a TMDL for it. So it can take quite a bit to put a TMDL together for all these pollutants. That's why we do not have a TMDL in place for all those pollutants yet. One of a really large effort the last 5 years was developing the mercury TMDL for the Willamette Basin, and that includes the Multnomah Channel area. As I was mentioning before, as part of TMDLs, we develop these water quality management plans where we name in those plans designated management agencies that are responsible for helping to reduce that pollutant in one way or another for what they have control over. So if you're a city, you have control over stormwater. There's forestry, like Forest Service and BLM, and looking at forestry practices, road management. So different DMAs have different responsibilities depending on what their practices are and what they do. For the Willamette Basin mercury TMDL, which is a little new, well, it's just new to the Multnomah Channel area, is that the 2006 Willamette Basin TMDL did not have any DMAs named in there from the Multnomah Channel area, which means that even though I know these groups, St. Helens, Scappoose, the county, they've been doing work all along that helps temperature issues, sediment issues, but there wasn't a requirement for them to do that. But as part of the mercury TMDL, the DMAs in this area, St. Helens, Scappoose, and the Columbia County, and also a couple of the drainage districts were named as responsible parties. So they have all developed TMDL implementation plans to reduce mercury. And I think someone had asked about where mercury is coming from, and to the Willamette Basin and generally to Oregon in general, it's the vast majority comes from atmospheric deposition, and then it lands on the surface, on trees, on the ground, and mercury gets then attached to sediment and in runoff and enters waterways that way. So really what we've been focusing on is reducing erosion and runoff into water bodies. So looking at as a way of reducing mercury, what you can control. We can't control what's coming outside of our state, but we can control how it gets into waterways. So those plans for mercury were due September 3rd. And so I am now in the process of reviewing the plans from these DMAs listed here, as well as about 15 other DMAs as well. We had about 170 DMAs named in the Willamette Basin TMDL, so quite a large number. And then just my last slide to note, so this is what I said I was going to mention earlier on, is we do have a temperature TMDL for the Willamette Basin. However, without getting into all the details, there was litigation on it. And it was about our natural conditions and our standard. And EPA was sued for approving DEQ's temperature TMDLs that were based on the natural criterion. And because of that litigation, DEQ has to replace about 14 TMDLs across the entire state by court-ordered timeframes. So that means we have to redo the Willamette temperature TMDL. They're still working out the details. This is mainly being project managed by our headquarters folks, so basin coordinators are going to be working with them as well. But it may be split, the Willamette Basin may be split into the main stem modeling and then some of the other tributary like basins, and have two separate ones, or they may be together. That's why I put both of these dates here. So first one must get to EPA for approval by January of 2024, and then for the main stem, February 28, 2025. And just to note that some of the DMAs that were listed for the mercury TMDL would likely also be listed for temperature TMDL. So I think that's all I was going to cover. Let me stop sharing.
So Andrea, this is Greg. I want to thank you very much for excellent presentation, right? Just exactly what I wanted to see. And what you did was you pulled together through the integrated report, the data from all the different sources out there that are doing work, which gave us a really complete picture of what we know about what's going on as far as the data that's been collected in the basin. That was very helpful. Thank you. And as far, I didn't realize that that our little streams here were covered by the Lower Willamette Basin bacteria TMDL, so we need to take a look at that. That's what we're supposed to be doing. I do have a question. Is there any litigation that you know of about the Forest Practices Act? Because it's basically as part of the temperature TMDL, it's I think we kind of go by the notion that if you're complying with Forest Practices Act, you're going to meet water quality standards. Is there any litigation or anything going on as to that issue?
Well, I don't know. There was recently a big effort with the Oregon Department of Forestry, and just what you said, generally, if you're meeting Forest Practices Act, you're meeting water quality standards, but that's not necessarily the case anymore. ODF worked with, gosh, and Aaron, you might know all the different groups, but a lot of different environmental groups and other groups to develop this, the private forest accords, which is honestly a game changer for Oregon Department of Forestry. They are currently developing rules that are supposed to be in place by, I believe, the end of November, which is very different than what their rules were before. There's a lot more protective measures, buffers on fish-bearing and non-fish bearing streams, steep slope protection. They have to do road inventories. And along with that is they're getting money too for some of those small forest land owners who it can be challenging having the money needed to do what they need to do. And so there's also a grant program being put into place. So I think a lot of people are feeling really positive about the private forest accords coming into place, getting into rule, and what that might mean for kind of future practices at ODF. And just note, ODF actually, they in our Oregon administrative rules, they never had to develop a TMDL implementation plan, and Oregon Department of Ag did not either. They're explicitly exempted from developing plans. We tended to look to the area plans and rules for ODA and the Forest Practices Act for ODF. But now they are voluntarily developing mercury plans for the Willamette Basin. So both ODA and ODF are developing mercury TMDL implementation plans.
So what about the Senate Bill 1010 plans for agriculture? Are those still in existence?
Yeah, those are still moving forward, but and those plans are really good for certain things, but what some of the conversations have been that for TMDL implementation, we needed more specific information of what Oregon Department of Ag and Oregon Department of Forestry are doing. And so developing these plans we will likely get more specific, measurable types of actions through these TMDL implementation plans. So those are still going on, Greg. Those will still, the area will still do those biennial reviews. Those are still going on.
So just a one observation that kind of surprised me was so many of the sites not only didn't meet the temperature standard, which is not surprising, but they didn't meet the DO standard and the high bacteria counts as well, fairly far up in these watersheds where there's really not much going on besides private forestry.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank all the speakers, and for those who attended, I want to remind them that this presentation is being recorded, and so Nicole will, maybe she can tell us how people can see that. It'll probably be posted on our website, but excellent presentations. Thank you very much. Lots of food for thought for us moving forward as we discuss the water quality problem. I really appreciate the time you guys took to putting together these presentations and sharing them with us. Very well done. Thank you.
Absolutely. I just want to echo what Greg said about, thank you to the presenters and thank you to the community members that showed up as well to listen in and participate. I think that's one of the vital parts of what we're trying to do here is take a collaborative approach to this. The Scappoose Bay, so let's see, to your question, Greg, where can you find the recording? We will post the recording to our events page. If you go back to the calendar appointment on our events calendar for this event, we will have our, where the meeting link to join tonight will then become a link to watch the video recording. And if you'd like to go back to our June meeting, we have the educational session from that meeting posted there. The Scappoose Bay Watershed Council Board of Directors would like to recognize our current watershed coordinator, Andy Magi. He was presented a fantastic opportunity to advocate for rivers at a national level and will be stepping down this Friday. The board fully supports this transition and we are excited for the changes to come. Andy and his family will remain in Scappoose and he will continue to advocate for our watershed as he transitions to our board of directors this fall. Please reach out to Andy to congratulate him on this huge opportunity. There will be an opportunity in November that we'd like to invite you to join us. Please mark your calendars to join us in St. Helens at the Crooked Creek Brewery on Thursday, November 3rd at 5 p.m. This will be an opportunity to congratulate Andy in person and hopefully meet our new coordinator. The brewery will be donating a portion of the proceeds from that evening to the Watershed Council as well. So tell all your friends. We would also like to invite you to our fall native plant sale on the second Saturday coming up here pretty soon in October. It'll be at Scappoose High School Greenhouse, and it's a great way for us to get native plants out into our community to support our native pollinators. Again, I'd like to thank everyone who turned out tonight, and please join us for our next educational session in December. Alex Gorman with Oregon State University Extension Service will be joining us to discuss the recent appearance of the emerald ash borer. So thanks again, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Andrea, I enjoyed your talk.